There is a map. It is sitting right now in a museum in Nuremberg, Germany, behind glass, under controlled light, carefully preserved and carefully ignored by most of the world. It was made in 1492, but the data it contains, the coastlines it traces, the land masses it hints at, the geometry it encodes, that data is far, far older. And here is the thing that will keep you up tonight. This is not the most troubling map in history. That honor belongs to a different one made a full year before Columbus left the harbor, one that seemed to know, in outline, in proportion, in haunting geographic suggestion, that something enormous was waiting on the other side of the ocean, something no living European in 1491 should have known was there. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not fringe history. This is the documented, peer-reviewed, academically verified mystery of Renaissance cartography. The story of maps that contain knowledge they have no right to contain, drawn by hands that should not have known what they were drawing. And once you understand what the geometry of these charts actually implies, you will never look at a map the same way again. Because the real question is not what these maps show. The real question is who made them first, and what happened to that civilization after. To understand why the 1491 map matters, you have to feel the intellectual atmosphere of late medieval Europe, the limits of what educated men believed could be known. Because in 1491, the ocean to the west was not merely uncharted. It was, in the minds of most serious scholars, essentially uncrossable. The ancient Greeks had theorized a spherical Earth, and medieval scholars largely accepted this. What they could not accept was that the Atlantic could be survived. The distances were assumed to be fatal. The world, as far as educated Europeans were concerned, consisted of 3 land masses: Europe, Asia, and Africa. That was it. That was everything. Columbus himself, when he proposed his voyage, was not arguing that the Earth was round. Everyone already knew that. He was arguing that Asia was much closer to the west than anyone believed. He was catastrophically wrong about that. He reached land not because his calculations were right, but because land happened to be there. Land that no serious European model of geography had predicted. Land that the maps of 1491 should not have been able to suggest. And yet, there is a map, made before he sailed, and it shows something that should not be there. His name was Henricus Martellus Germanus, a German cartographer working in Florence, who, in approximately 1491, produced a world map. On the surface, it looks typical, dense with Latin text, slightly awkward in proportion, the product of accumulated Ptolemaic tradition. But look at the eastern coast of Asia, stretching down toward what Martellus labeled as a great southern peninsula. Look at the proportions. Look at the geometry. Something is wrong, or rather, something is right in a way that it should not be. In 2015, a team at Yale University applied multispectral imaging to the Martellus map, using ultraviolet and infrared light to reveal text that had faded into invisibility over 5 centuries. What they found astonished them. The map contained dense textual annotations, detailed place names, navigational notes, layers of information completely invisible to ordinary examination for 500 years. And when they analyzed the geometry of what Martellus had drawn, a deeply disturbing pattern emerged. The eastern coastline of Asia matched in geometric proportion the actual coastline of the Americas, not perfectly, but in the proportional structural sense that suggested Martellus, or the source he was copying from, had access to geographic information about landmasses that 1491 Europe had no official record of encountering. Some historians now believe Columbus studied this map before he sailed. He may have known, in some half-understood sense, that there was something out there, not Asia, something, a landmass. The question is where Martellus got that information, because Martellus did not sail anywhere. He was a synthesizer, a man who copied from sources, and his sources point backward, towards something older. To follow this thread, you have to go back further, much further, back to 1275. Back to the moment when, without explanation, without predecessors, without any visible developmental stages, a new kind of map appeared in the Mediterranean world. These were the Portolan Charts, nautical maps of the Mediterranean and Black Sea rendered on parchment with a precision that medieval technology had absolutely no business achieving. The oldest surviving example, the Carta Pisana, now held in Paris, shows the Mediterranean with an accuracy that should have been impossible. The coastlines are correct, the proportions are right, the angular relationships between ports and headlands and islands, all of it encoded with a fidelity confirmed by modern analysis to be equivalent to 19th century cartographic standards. Think about what that means. Medieval maps, produced without telescopes, without chronometers, without any reliable means of measuring longitude, match the accuracy of maps made with modern scientific instruments 6 centuries later. And they appeared fully formed, no rough drafts, no developmental period, no evidence of gradual improvement. One moment, they did not exist. The next moment, they were among the most accurate maps ever made. Roel Nicolai, a Dutch scholar at Utrecht University, spent years of his professional life trying to understand how this was possible. His doctoral thesis, published in 2016 by Brill, one of the most respected academic presses in the world, laid out the results of his geodetic analysis with methodical, devastating clarity. He measured the relationship between real geography and charted geography with statistical precision. He found a root mean squared error of approximately 11.3 kilometers across the charts. For medieval cartography, this was not merely impressive. It was, by any reasonable analysis, impossible. When Nicolai tried to recreate these maps using actual medieval methods, averaging multiple observations, synthesizing sailors' reports, employing the techniques available to 13th century craftsmen, the results were roughly 1,000% less accurate. The gap was not a matter of degree, it was categorical. The Portolan Charts were not products of medieval skill. They were copies of something far older, something far more sophisticated. But Nicolai's most unsettling discovery was not the accuracy. In 1987, researcher Scott Loomer took 26 surviving Portolan charts and tested them against 9 different mathematical map projections, the systems that translate the curved surface of the Earth onto a flat surface. He wanted to know which mathematical framework the original creator had used. The answer was unambiguous across all 26 charts. The Mercator projection, every single one. The problem is devastating. The Mercator projection was not invented until 1569. The oldest Portolan charts predate that by nearly 300 years. Medieval cartographers could not have used it. They did not know it existed, the mathematical framework that Gerardus Mercator would eventually formalize. The framework that revolutionized navigation for centuries was already encoded in maps made in 1275, unless the source of those maps used the Mercator projection. Unless someone, somewhere, before 1275, had developed the same mathematical insight that Mercator would rediscover centuries later, encoding it into maps that were then copied and recopied and partially degraded until what survived was a mosaic of fragments, accurate at long range, inaccurate at short range, organized around mathematics the copyists no longer understood. There is one more detail that makes all of this impossible to dismiss. One piece of evidence that removes this from abstract statistics and plants it firmly in the physical world. Some of the ports named on the Portolan charts, real harbors, specific named places, had silted up centuries before the charts were supposedly drawn. They had been abandoned, become unusable, buried under accumulated sediment, invisible to the ships of the medieval period. A cartographer in 1300 mapping the Mediterranean from contemporary observation would have had no reason to include them. They were not functional, they were not visible, and yet there they are, named, located, charted with the same precision as everything else. The only explanation is the source. Someone recorded these ports when they still functioned, when ships docked in them, when merchants counted their cargoes on their quays. That recording was preserved, in what form we cannot say, and eventually made its way into the Portolan tradition, embedded in source material that medieval cartographers assembled without fully understanding what they were assembling. The dates implied by the silted ports push the original source maps back, not just decades, but potentially centuries. The original knowledge may be Roman, it may be older than Rome, and combined with the Mercator projection evidence, it implies mathematical sophistication we do not confidently associate with any documented ancient civilization. The most academically credible explanation involves Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was the direct inheritor of Roman and Greek intellectual tradition. Byzantine libraries preserved texts and maps and geographic syntheses that the Western Roman Empire had lost during the centuries of collapse. They maintained contact with the accumulated geographic knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world, holding materials that Western Europe had simply forgotten existed. Much of what Byzantine libraries contained was destroyed when Ottoman forces took Constantinople in 1453, a millennium of accumulated knowledge gone in a generation. But before that fall, Byzantine knowledge circulated widely. Venetian merchants had trading colonies in Byzantine territory for centuries. Genoese merchants maintained extensive relationships with Constantinople. It is entirely plausible, it is in fact the most historically coherent explanation available, that the Portolan Charts represent the copying and preservation of Byzantine originals, that themselves preserved Roman originals, that themselves copied something older still. A chain of transmission stretching back through the centuries, each link degrading slightly, each generation of copyists understanding a little less than the last about the mathematical principles encoded in the originals. Until by 1275, what arrived in Italian port cities was a sophisticated artifact whose foundations no one could any longer explain. This is how knowledge dies and survives simultaneously. The map is copied, the mathematics behind it is forgotten. The coastlines are reproduced. The civilization that first measured them has vanished. And then, centuries later, scholars sit down with spectral imaging equipment and statistical software and begin asking questions that the medieval copyists never thought to ask, because the medieval copyists never imagined their sources required explanation. Return now to Henricus Martellus, returned to Florence in 1491. Martellus was working in exactly this tradition, a synthesizer, an assembler, a cartographer who combined multiple sources into unified world maps. The sources available to him in Florence in the late 15th century were extraordinary by any standard. Florence in 1491 was one of the intellectual capitals of the world, home to the Medici Library, a recipient of Byzantine refugee scholars who had fled Constantinople after 1453, bringing with them manuscripts and maps and geographic knowledge accumulated over centuries. Martellus had access to Ptolemy. He had access to updated versions of Ptolemaic geography informed by Portuguese exploration along the African coast. He had access, almost certainly, to maps and geographic traditions that we cannot fully reconstruct because the originals have been lost to time. And what he produced, what that map shows when you illuminate it with ultraviolet light and begin to trace its hidden annotations, suggests that among the sources available to him was information about geographic reality that should not have existed in any European tradition. The proportional echoes of American coastlines in his rendering of Eastern Asia. The structural hints of a Western landmass sitting at the edge of the ocean. These are not proof of pre-Columbian contact in any simple sense. They are proof of something more mysterious and more intellectually challenging, that the flow of geographic knowledge through human history is not the clean, progressive story we were taught, with each generation building logically on the last. It is instead a story of loss and preservation, of civilizations rising and falling and leaving fragments behind, of knowledge encoded in maps that outlasted the understanding of that knowledge, of ancient accuracy preserved in medieval copies, preserved in Renaissance syntheses, until a German cartographer in Florence assembled pieces he did not fully understand into a world map that just hinted, at what lay to the west. Here is what we know with certainty. The Portolan Charts are real. The statistical analysis of their accuracy is real. The Mercator projection match is real. The silted ports are real. The Martellus map is real. And the Yale multispectral imaging project is real. What does not exist, what cannot be produced, is a satisfying explanation. The Byzantine hypothesis is coherent but incomplete. It explains how knowledge might have been transmitted across centuries, but it does not explain where that knowledge first originated. Who possessed Mercator projection mathematics before Mercator, who first mapped ports that would later silt into invisibility? We are left, as Roel Nicolai was left, as every serious scholar who has engaged honestly with this material is ultimately left with a gap A civilization-sized gap where a people or a tradition possess geographic and mathematical knowledge we have not credited to any known historical actor. They mapped the Mediterranean with modern precision. They understood spherical geometry well enough to encode Mercator mathematics before Mercator was born. And then they were gone. What remains of them are the copies. Between 130 and 180 Portolan Charts survive from the medieval period, spread across libraries in Europe and North America. Each one a fragment of a mosaic, each one pointing backward towards something that history has not yet named. You can find high-resolution images of these charts online right now. You can trace the coastlines yourself. You can verify the accuracy against modern satellite data. You can see the seams where different ancient source materials were stitched into one medieval whole. And you can ask the question that Nicolai left unanswered. What civilization possessed this knowledge? What happened to them? That only the maps survived? The scientific consensus is that the origin remains officially, academically, unresolved, not dismissed. Unresolved. There is a crucial difference. Dismissed means the answer is nothing here. Move on. Unresolved means the evidence is real, the mystery is genuine, and the answer simply has not yet been found. 1 year before Columbus sailed, Henricus Martellus drew a map, and somewhere in that map, encoded in proportions and outlines and the structural logic of coastlines he could not have personally observed, was the ghost of a civilization that already knew what was waiting to the west. We are still trying to learn their name. If this story unsettled you, if you found yourself leaning forward, if you caught yourself thinking about maps and knowledge and everything civilization has lost and somehow impossibly preserved, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. Every week we go deep into the stories that don't fit the standard historical narrative, not because we're chasing conspiracy, but because the real history, the documented, peer-reviewed, academically verified real history, is so much stranger and darker and more fascinating than anything anyone could have invented. The Portolan Charts are just the beginning. There are more maps, more gaps, more civilizations that left their fingerprints on the world and then disappeared. Subscribe now and don't miss what comes next. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload. And if you know someone who thinks history is boring, send them this video right now. Because history is not boring. History is the most mysterious thing in the world. We just have to know where to look. Disclaimer: this video has been created solely for educational and informational purposes, educational and documentary. The content is based on an analysis of historical hypotheses and private research, in particular the works of R. Nicolai, which may differ from generally accepted scientific data. We do not claim that the theories presented are definitively true and encourage open scientific discussion. All materials are used under fair use for critical analysis and commentary. The author does not condone misinformation and recommends that viewers consult peer-reviewed scientific publications to obtain a complete picture.